The clock read 6:30 when I reached for the alarm button, even though it hadn't rung yet. In 32 years as a dispatcher for the Escondido Express cab service, my body had learned to wake up on its own. Having retired 3 years ago, I still continued to get up before dawn. Old habits die hard. My name is Lorraine Pritchard. I'm 67, and I've spent most of my life answering phones and assigning cars to customers and drivers. My modest apartment on the east side of Escondido was never sophisticated, but it served as a safe haven for me and my son Tate after Randall, my husband, was killed in a car accident. Tate had only turned 10 at the time. I poured myself my first cup of coffee and walked to the window. It was a typical December morning for our town, a chilly but sunny morning. I'd always found California winters deceptive. The bright sun made it seem warm until you stepped outside and felt the cold wind chill through your bones. My kitchen window overlooked the small yard of a neighboring house where a young family with 2 children lived. A boy, about the same age as my grandson Ezra, was riding a tricycle under his mother's supervision. I watched them and felt my heart clench. 5 years ago, when Tate called to announce the birth of his son, I cried tears of joy. A grandson, a new beginning, a new chance at a family, I thought. But the reality was different. The walls of my apartment were adorned with photos of Tate, from infancy to his college graduation. Lost among them were just 2 pictures of Ezra. In the first, he was a few months old and I was holding him in my arms, smiling awkwardly at the camera. The second showed Ezra, already 2 years old, sitting on a swing set at the park with me standing next to him. I didn't have any more pictures. My son grew up to be a successful graphic designer. He was always talented, drawing since he was a child, and I did everything I could to support his gift. Working overtime, saving every dime I could to pay for his art classes and then college. We lived modestly, sometimes on the edge of poverty, but Tate never went without what he needed. "You're the only thing I have, my boy," I told him often. Perhaps too often. I realize now that I'd placed the burden on his fragile, childlike shoulders to be my only comfort, my only joy after Randall's death. It wasn't fair. After college, Tate quickly found a job at an advertising agency in San Diego, 40 minutes from Escondido. I was so proud. He came over every Sunday for lunch and talked about his projects, and I listened with admiration, even though I didn't understand much of his professional jargon. Then he met Evie. Evie Lamont was a copywriter at the same agency. Slender, with cold gray eyes and always perfectly styled brown hair, she had grown up in a wealthy family from La Jolla and had been educated at a prestigious university. When Tate brought her over for Sunday lunch, I did my best. I cooked my best meal, a roast from my mother's recipe, and covered the table with the ceremonial tablecloth I used only on special occasions. Evie smiled politely, but I could feel her appraising gaze sliding over the worn furniture, the old-fashioned knickknacks I'd collected over the years, my rough-skinned hands with short nails, the hands of a woman who'd worked all her life. After that first visit, Tate started coming less often and then stopped inviting me over altogether when he and Evie moved in together. "Mom, we have so much work right now, just a crazy schedule," he explained over the phone. "Next time, I promise." The next time didn't come until they announced their engagement. The wedding was at an expensive country club organized by Evie's parents. I bought a new dress, spending more on it than I could afford, but I still felt out of place among the elegant guests. Evie's relatives chatted politely with me about the weather and the beauty of the ceremony site, but quickly backed away after finding an excuse. I caught a few sympathetic glances thrown in my direction. In the wedding photos I was sent a month later, I looked like an outsider who had accidentally walked into the frame. Tate and Evie glowed, surrounded by her family and friends. After the wedding, our relationship became even more strained. I called once a week, But the conversations were short and superficial. Tate was always in a hurry, always busy. Sometimes Evie would pick up the phone, and her voice would become high and artificially cheerful, as if she were talking to a child or a very elderly person who wasn't thinking straight. "Lorraine, how nice of you to call. Tate is working on an important project right now, but I'll be sure to tell her you called." When they announced that they were expecting a baby, I let myself get my hopes up. A baby would change everything, I thought. I could help with the baby, be a part of their lives. I knitted tiny socks and hats, bought a book on modern parenting so I wouldn't seem backward, even considered moving closer to their new home in the northern suburbs of San Diego. Ezra was born in the spring, a healthy boy weighing 3 pounds 500 grams. Tate emailed me a picture, a tiny red face framed by a hospital blanket. I printed out the photo and framed it. I wasn't allowed to visit them until 2 weeks after I was discharged from the hospital. "Evie needs time to recover and get used to being a mom," Tate explained. I nodded, even though everything inside was clenching with pain. Once upon a time, when Tate himself was born, my mother-in-law had been there for me from day one, helping me, showing me how to hold the baby, how to feed, how to soothe. I was so grateful to her then. My first meeting with my grandson was a short visit of 2 hours. Tate and Evie's home was a modern structure of glass and concrete with a minimalist interior that must have cost a fortune. Ezra slept through most of my visit, and when he woke up and cried, Evie quickly picked him up, telling him he needed a feeding and a diaper change. She left for the nursery and didn't return. Tate walked me to the door, absent-mindedly pecked me on the cheek, and promised to call me next week. In the first year of Ezra's life, I'd only seen him 6 times. Always short visits, always under Evie's watchful eye. I brought gifts, toys, clothes, children's books, but most of them seemed to disappear as soon as I left. One day, I brought a teddy bear I'd specially chosen, soft and perfect for cuddling. On my next visit, a month later, I asked about him. "Oh, we gave it to charity," Evie replied carelessly. "We already have too many stuffed toys and they're collecting dust. Ezra needs educational toys that stimulate his intellect." I tried not to show how hurt I was by that comment. A teddy bear would stimulate his emotional intelligence, I wanted to say, but I remained silent. When Ezra turned 2, the visits became even less frequent. Tate always made excuses. They were too busy. Ezra had a developmental class. Evie had a migraine. They were going away for the weekend. The list was endless. The list was endless. Phone conversations turned into short messages, and even those were answered by Tate with a few days' delay. 3 years ago, I retired, hoping that now I would have more time for my family, for my grandson. Instead, I found myself even more isolated. Most of my friends were still working or had moved closer to their children and grandchildren. My days were filled with watching TV, reading, and sometimes taking walks in the neighborhood if the weather permitted. I signed up for art classes at the local community center, remembering how much I loved to paint when I was younger, before life and the need to provide for Tate and me pushed all hobbies to the back burner. The last time I met Ezra was about a year ago, on his 4th birthday. Tate had thrown a party at an entertainment center for kids, complete with animators, a huge cake, and 20 little guests. I felt out of place among the young parents, who all seemed to know each other and were discussing the latest trends in education and baby food. Ezra barely paid attention to me, engrossed in playing with his peers. When I tried to hug him and hand him a gift, a carefully chosen art set, he politely thanked me with a memorized phrase and immediately ran away. Later, I noticed Evie put my gift aside without even opening it. "We'll be sure to text you if he liked the set," she said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I never got any message. After that party, I tried calling regularly, offering my help with the baby, inviting them to lunch. Evie always responded with polite refusals. Tate increasingly didn't pick up the phone at all. "We're really busy right now, Mom," he'd say in the rare moments when he did answer. "Ezra has a lot of classes, and Evie and I are both working on big projects. Last Christmas, I bought tickets to a children's performance of The Nutcracker, hoping to spend time with my grandson. Tate canceled plans at the last minute, citing Ezra's cold. The next day, I saw pictures on social media that Evie's sister had posted. The whole family at a ski resort, Ezra, rosy-cheeked and healthy, sledding. I didn't call and demand an explanation. What was the point? It was clear that I didn't fit into their perfect picture of family life. I, with my humble background, my job as a cab dispatcher, my old-fashioned looks and manners, was an awkward reminder to them, especially Evie, of where Tate had come from. And he, my son, whom I'd raised alone, for whom I'd worked to exhaustion, to whom I'd given everything I had let it happen. On dark nights when sleeplessness overcame me, I asked myself, what had I done wrong? Why had my son become so cold, so aloof? Maybe I was pushing him too hard, setting too high expectations. Or, on the contrary, not guiding him enough, letting him do too much. There were no answers, only the silence of the apartment and the ticking of the clock on the wall. After my last bad call in October, when Tate had irritably said he'd call back later but never did, I'd decided to back off. I stopped calling, stopped trying. If he wanted to communicate with his mother, let him take the initiative. He called me on Thanksgiving, lasted exactly 3 minutes. He wished me a happy holiday, asked how I was doing, told me that he and Evie and Ezra were going to visit her parents in Santa Barbara. Not a word about Christmas plans, not a hint of a reunion. After that call, I sat on the couch looking at an old picture of Tate and Randall and me on the beach, all smiles, happy and carefree. It was a month before Randall died. The last summer we were a complete family. "What would you do, Randall?" I asked the picture. "How would you reach out to our son?" Of course, the picture didn't answer. Randall left 27 years ago, and I was left alone to deal with everything: grief, raising my son, life. Now it seems I'm alone again, but in a different way. My son is alive, but lost to me as surely as if he were gone. And somewhere out there, my grandson is growing up without knowing his grandmother, without hearing stories about his father as a child, without receiving the unconditional love that only a grandmother can give. I turned away from the window, finished my cooled coffee, and began to prepare for another day in an empty apartment where the only conversation was the news on TV and occasional calls from telemarketers. Christmas was less than a month away, and I knew I'd probably spend it alone. Just like last year, just like the year before that. Perhaps I should have accepted that my son had chosen a different life, a different family where I had no place. But something inside me, a stubborn voice that sounded suspiciously like Randall's, kept whispering, "Don't give up. Your grandson deserves to know he has a grandmother who loves him, and your son, no matter what, is still your son." With these thoughts, I walked to the bathroom to shower and start a new day, not yet knowing that in a few weeks my life would change forever. Outside my apartment window, the multicolored garlands that my downstairs neighbor had hung on his balcony were flashing. Red, green, and blue lights reflected in the glass and cast bizarre shadows on the walls of my living room. I sat in an old armchair, wrapped in a blanket, and looked at the small artificial Christmas tree I had placed on the coffee table. That tree had served me well for the past 15 years, since Tate had stopped coming home for Christmas. December 22nd. The holiday was 3 days away, and I still didn't have any plans. What plans could there be anyway? For the past 4 years, I'd spent Christmas alone, occasionally accepting an invitation from Donna, a former co-worker at the cab service, to join their family dinner. But this year, Donna had gone to visit her daughter in Florida, and even that option had fallen away. I pulled out a box of Christmas tree toys, old but cherished. Each held a different story. Here was a glass ball with a painted snowman, the first gift from Randall after our wedding. There's the clay angel figurine Tate molded in kindergarten, clumsy, with crooked wings and a smile that took up half his face. Here's the wooden star we bought at the Christmas fair when Tate was 7. Carefully hanging the toys on the small Christmas tree, I thought back to holidays past. Christmas had always been a special time in our family. Randall loved the holidays and brought a special atmosphere to the house. The smell of freshly baked cookies, the sounds of Christmas carols, the warmth of the fireplace, when we still lived in the house before he died. After he died, I tried to keep the traditions alive for Tate's sake. We still baked cookies, decorated the tree, watched Christmas movies. Money was tight, but I always found a way to give my son something he wanted, whether it was a new bike or an art set. Seeing his joy on Christmas morning was the best gift to me. When Tate left for college, he still came home for the holidays. We spent quiet but cozy evenings, just the two of us. I'd cook his favorite turkey with cranberry sauce. We'd exchange gifts, and then we'd watch old movies and reminisce about Dad. Everything changed after Evie came along. First, they started spending Christmas alternating, one year with her family, the next with me. Then the visits to me got shorter and shorter. First, they stayed all day, then just for lunch, and the last time Tate stopped by for an hour to deliver a gift and go straight to Evie's parents' house for dinner. After Ezra was born, I didn't even count on them coming to visit me. Instead, I asked if I could come visit them even for a little while. Ezra's first Christmas, I was allowed to spend the morning with them. I watched him, still very tiny, stare bewildered at the bright lights of the Christmas tree. The second Christmas, I received an invitation to an evening dinner, but felt more like a guest than a family member. For the past 3 years, Tate had always found a reason why we couldn't get together for Christmas. Either they were going to Evie's parents' house in the country, or they were planning a trip to a ski resort, or Ezra was sick, or they had other plans. I hung the last toy, a silver snowflake, and stepped back to assess the result. The tree looked dressed up, but stood lonely on the table, like a reminder that the holidays are family time, and my family had chosen to spend it without me. The phone rang, snapping me out of my sad musings. The number was an unfamiliar one. Dash, dash. Hello? I answered cautiously. Lorraine, is that you? The woman's voice sounded vaguely familiar. It's Susan Ellington, your former neighbor. Susan had lived across the street when Tate and I still lived in the small house on Maple Street. Her daughter Carrie was a couple years older than Tate, and they often played together. After Randall died, when I had to sell the house and move into an apartment, we lost touch. Susan, what a surprise! I smiled involuntarily. How did you find me? Oh, I met Donna at the supermarket a couple weeks ago, and she gave me your number. I hope you don't mind. Of course not. It's good to hear from you. How are you? How's Carrie? We exchanged some news. Carrie's married now, lives in Oregon, has 2 kids. Susan was widowed 5 years ago, but recently met a new life partner. She still lives in the same house on Maple Street. How's your Tate? Susan asked. Donna said he had a family of his own now, a little boy growing up. Yes. I tried to make my voice sound happy. Ezra's 5 now. Tate's a graphic designer, and they live in San Diego. You know, that's why I'm calling. Susan's voice grew serious. I saw your grandson last week. It was a coincidence. I was in San Diego visiting a friend, and we went to a park near her house, and there was a playground there, and I saw a boy who looked so much like Tate as a child that I couldn't help but get closer. My heart squeezed. Susan had seen Ezra and I hadn't. Not in almost a year. They named him Ezra, didn't they? Susan continued. I heard a woman call out to him. Must have been his mother. Slim, strict hair. She looked, I don't know how to put it. Cold? She wasn't playing with him, just sitting on the bench, staring at her phone the whole time. It was definitely Evie. I pictured her, in her perfectly tailored outfit, her manicure intact, staring at the screen of her latest iPhone. Lorraine, I don't want to pry. Susan hesitated. But there's something wrong with the boy. What do you mean? I straightened in my chair, suddenly alert. He was playing alone, even though there were lots of kids on the playground. And he was so quiet. Remember how noisy Tate was? Always laughing, talking to himself, making up games. And this boy was just quietly swinging on the swing set. And when another kid came up to him, he just stepped aside, like he was scared. I listened, and anxiety grew inside of me. Maybe Ezra was just shy, or wasn't feeling well that day. One more thing. Susan lowered her voice, as if she was afraid someone would overhear. When he went up the slide, I noticed the bruises on his arm, above the elbow, as if someone had grabbed him hard, and another on his neck, near his hairline. An icy chill ran down my spine. Are you sure those were bruises? My voice shook. Maybe he just fell. Kids fall all the time. Lorraine, I was a school nurse for 30 years. Susan's voice was firm. I know what bruises look like from a fall, and I know what bruises look like from a tackle. These were from a tackle. I also noticed the way he flinched when his mother raised her voice at him. I closed my eyes, trying to digest what I was hearing. The bruises, the frightened look, my grandson, my little Ezra. Did you talk to them? I asked. No, Susan sighed. I wanted to go over and introduce myself, but something stopped me. The look on that woman's face. She looked annoyed, impatient, and I thought if I said I knew you, it might hurt the boy somehow. So I decided to call you first. We talked some more. Susan apologized that maybe she had alarmed me for nothing, that maybe she had too much imagination. But I knew she wouldn't call for no reason. Susan was always observant and caring. If she noticed something amiss, then there really was something to look out for. After the conversation, I couldn't find my place. Bruises on my arm and neck. A scared, quiet child. My grandson, whom I hardly knew, whom I wasn't allowed to see. I went to the closet and pulled out an old photo album. Flipping through the pages of pictures of little Tate, I tried to find a resemblance to the boy Susan had described. My son had always been a cheerful, outgoing child. Even after his father's death, after going through a period of quiet sadness, he began laughing again, playing, drawing his fantasy worlds full of dragons and knights. Closing the album, I went to the window. It was already dark, and the lights of the neighbor's Christmas decorations seemed blurred through the glass, on which moisture from my breath condensed. What was going on in my son's family? Could Tate? No, impossible. My boy would never raise a hand to a child. He grew up without physical punishment himself. Randall was adamantly against belts or spankings, and after he died, I just didn't have the heart to hit my son, who'd already lost his father. But Evie, I remembered her cold stare, her irritation when Ezra had accidentally spilled juice on the carpet during my last visit. She hadn't said anything then, just pressed her lips together and led the boy out of the room. I heard her reprimanding him in the next room, her voice quiet but harsh. I spent a sleepless night tossing and turning in bed, replaying the conversation with Susan in my head. By morning, I decided to call Tate. Maybe he could explain. Maybe there was an innocent explanation for everything. Tate's phone was turned off or out of range. I left a message asking for a callback, but there was no answer. I dialed their home number and Evie answered. Her voice, as always, became high and artificially cheerful when she recognized me. Lorraine, what a surprise! How are you? Hello, Evie. I wanted to talk to Tate. Oh, he's in a meeting with a client right now. It's a very important project, and he's going to be busy all day. Is there anything I can do to help? I just wanted to know about your Christmas plans. I lied, deciding not to mention the conversation with Susan. Maybe we could spend it together this year. There was a pause. I'm afraid we can't do it this year. Evie's voice sounded fake, regretful. We're going to my parents in Santa Barbara. They're organizing a big family gathering, and all my siblings and kids are coming. Ezra is so looking forward to seeing his cousins. I understand. I tried to keep the disappointment from seeping into my voice. What about before you leave? Maybe I could stop by, drop off a gift for Ezra. We're leaving tomorrow and won't be back until after New Year's, Evie answered quickly. It's so hectic with packing right now. I don't even know if we'll have time. But I'll be sure to tell Tate you called. Maybe we can get together in January. I'll put it on my calendar, January. It's always January or February or next month or whenever it's more convenient. In the meantime, my grandson is probably suffering, wearing bruises, afraid of loud voices. After my conversation with Evie, I sat looking at my phone and felt the resolve building up inside. No, this can't go on. I have to see Ezra. I have to make sure he's okay. I couldn't believe they were going to Santa Barbara. It was the exact same story last year, and then pictures on social media gave away their real location. Most likely they were planning to spend Christmas at home, just without me. The thought of arriving uninvited was unsettling. Tate would be furious. Evie probably wouldn't even let me in the door. But what if Susan was right? What if my grandson really is in danger? I started planning. The bus to San Diego runs every hour. It would take 20 minutes by cab from the bus station to Tate's house. I could be there Christmas Eve morning or Christmas Day morning. I'll bring presents, not just for Ezra, but for Tate and Evie as well, to soften their reactions to my appearance. If they're really gone, I'll just go home. But if they're there, I can see my grandson, see if he's okay. And if I see anything suspicious, what then? Call the police? Child Protective Services? The thought of it made me uneasy. I went to the closet and pulled out the money I'd been saving for a rainy day, $500 in crumpled bills, stored in an envelope under a stack of sweaters. That should be enough for tickets, cab fare, and a hotel if I needed to stay the night. Then I pulled out my suitcase and started packing. A warm sweater, a change of clothes, a toothbrush, medicine, and gifts. I bought an art kit and a teddy bear for Ezra, contrary to Evie's opinion that stuffed toys were useless. A warm hand-knitted scarf for Tate and a jewelry box I'd found on sale at an antique store for Evie. Wrapping the gifts in brightly colored paper, I attached a card with warm wishes to each one. As I looked at the neat stack of packages, my hands trembled. Fear and determination struggled within me. What if I was wrong? What if Susan was wrong? What if my sudden appearance would only worsen my already strained relationship with my son? But what if she's right? What if my grandson needs help and I sit at home, afraid of violating the boundaries set by Tate and Evie? I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote 2 letters. One to Donna, asking her to check on my apartment and water the flowers if I didn't return in a couple days. The other to myself, in case my resolve wavered. In it, I listed all the reasons I had to go. Ezra's strange behavior, the bruises Susan had noticed, Tate and Evie's constant excuses, their unwillingness to let me be a part of their grandson's life. When I finished the letter, I reread it, folded it, and put it in my pocket. The words would be a reminder if I started to have doubts. Then I checked the bus schedule. There's a 6 a.m. flight on December 25th, Christmas Day itself. I'll be in San Diego by 8 and get to Tate's house by 9. The kids usually get up early on Christmas morning to open presents, so they'll probably be home. I booked my ticket online. Modern technology is sometimes very convenient, and ordered a cab to pick me up from my house at 5:30 in the morning. Now all that was left to do was wait and hope that I was making the right choice. On the evening of the 24th, I hardly slept at all. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, imagining different scenarios for our meeting. Maybe Tate would be happy to see me. Maybe this would be the beginning of a reconciliation, or maybe he'd slam the door in my face. At 4:30, I got up, showered, and dressed in my best pantsuit, the dark blue one I usually wore to important meetings or church. I styled my hair and applied light makeup. Looking in the mirror, I saw a tired older woman with a determined expression on her face. Not exactly what I wanted to see, but I'd have to settle for that. The cab arrived at exactly 5:30. I took one last look around my apartment, checked to make sure the iron was off, locked the door, and went downstairs where my car was waiting. "Merry Christmas," the driver, a middle-aged man with a bushy mustache, greeted me. "To the bus station?" "Yes, to the bus station," I replied, settling into the back seat. "And Merry Christmas to you." As we drove through the deserted pre-dawn streets of Escondido, I looked out the window at the houses decorated for the holiday. The lights were already on in some. Families were waking up to open presents, prepare a holiday breakfast, and spend the day together. Soon, I thought, soon I'll be with my family too. And so be it. The bus arrived in San Diego right on schedule at 8 in the morning. The city greeted me with an unusual gray drizzle for Christmas. Not quite rain, but not fog either. Something in between that made my hair damp and small drops settle on my coat. Typical winter weather for Southern California, when the ocean air meets the chill of the mountains. The bus station was sparsely populated, with only a few lone passengers hurrying to the exit, probably to celebrate the holiday with family. Family. The word echoed with pain somewhere deep inside. I'd once had a real family, Randall, little Tate, and me. Now it was just memories and pictures in an old album. I walked outside and, covering my purse from the small drops, caught a cab. The driver, an elderly Hispanic man with kind eyes, helped me stow my suitcase in the trunk. "Christmas visit with the family?" He asked as we pulled into the driveway. "Yes, to see my son and grandson," I replied, trying to keep my voice confident and happy. "Oak Ridge Road, please." "Oh, I know the neighborhood. Nice houses, nice neighborhood." The driver nodded. "Lucky for your son." I didn't say anything. Yes, Tate was lucky to have a house, a modern structure in an upscale suburb, with all the amenities I could dream of. But was he lucky in life? Had he become a happy man, a good father? As we drove, I gazed at the streets of San Diego, decorated for the holiday. Contrary to the California weather, the locals were trying to create a traditional Christmas atmosphere: artificial snow on lawns, lighted reindeer, inflatable Santa Clauses on rooftops. People made up for the lack of real winter with decorations. 20 minutes later, the cab turned into the neighborhood where Tate lived. Perfectly mowed lawns, neat driveways, designer houses behind high fences, all screamed prosperity and social status. How different it was from the modest neighborhood where I'd rented an apartment. "It's around here somewhere," I said to the driver, looking at the house numbers. "I think it's the next corner." And then I saw him, a small figure against the gray morning. The child was sitting on the curb in front of one of the houses with his arms around his knees. "Stop, please," I said sharply. "Right here." The driver slowed down, looking at me through the rearview mirror in bewilderment. "But we haven't reached the right address yet." "It's okay, I'll get off here." I pulled out my wallet, counting out the bills. "How much do I owe you?" After paying and insisting that the driver leave, he obviously hesitated, not wanting to leave an elderly woman alone on the street on Christmas morning. I slowly approached the child. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like its pounding should be heard a mile away. It was Ezra, my grandson. I would have recognized him anywhere, even though I had only seen him a few times. The same facial features as Tate had as a child: the high forehead, the neat nose, the expressive eyes. Only unlike the always smiling Tate, Ezra's face was serious, almost sullen. He was sitting on the curb in front of Tate and Evie's house, dressed in pajamas and a light sweater. No jacket, no hat, no gloves. San Diego doesn't get real snow, of course, but it had been a chilly morning, the temperature no higher than 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and a fine drizzle soaked his clothes. Next to the boy stood a plastic toy, a transformer robot that seemed to have been forgotten. Ezra? I called softly, stepping closer. The boy flinched and lifted his head. His eyes widened with surprise and perhaps fear. Do you remember me? I'm your grandmother, Lorraine. He looked at me warily, not moving. I saw you at your birthday party, I continued, squatting down next to him, not too close so as not to startle him. I gave you an art set. I remember, he said quietly. His lips turned slightly blue from the cold. Mom said the paints might stain the carpet. Something clenched in my chest. What are you doing outside by yourself, honey? And in this cold weather? Ezra lowered his eyes, rubbing the thread on the sleeve of his sweater. I've been naughty. Mommy told me to think about my behavior. Naughty? I tried to keep my voice calm, even though I was seething inside. What happened? I broke my mom's vase, Ezra whispered. I didn't mean to. I just wanted to see my presents under the tree. I looked back at the house. Through the large panoramic windows, I could see the living room modern, stylish, minimalist decor. A Christmas tree, decorated in a uniform color scheme of silver and blue, stood by the fireplace, and next to the fireplace, my heart skipped a beat. Tate and Evie were sitting in armchairs, glasses in hand, laughing about something. The warm light from the fireplace illuminated their faces, creating the illusion of a perfect family scene. Only missing from this perfect picture was a child who was shivering from the cold outside. How long have you been sitting here? I asked, taking off my coat and slipping it over Ezra's shoulders. I don't know, the boy shrugged. The sun wasn't up yet when my mom told me to get out. Not until dawn. So he'd been sitting here for at least 2 or 3 hours. A little boy alone on Christmas morning, while his parents— I couldn't finish that thought. Anger rose up in a wave inside me, drowning out all other feelings. Come with me, sweetheart. I held out my hand. You're cold, you need to warm up. Ezra looked hesitantly at the house, then at me. But my mom said not to come in until she said it was okay. I'll talk to your mom, I said firmly. Come on, take my hand. When his little palm touched mine, I felt how cold it was. The baby was practically stiff from sitting outside. I helped him stand up and noticed the way he wrinkled his legs as he straightened them out. They must be stiff from sitting in the same position for so long. Can I have Optimus? He asked, pointing to the robot toy. Sure. I picked it up and handed it to him. Is this your friend? Ezra nodded, holding the robot to his chest. Dad gave it to me. Mom says it's a stupid toy, but Dad says I'm allowed to play with it. I remembered buying Tate a similar toy a long time ago, when they were the first Transformers on the market. He'd loved it, played with it for hours, making up stories about heroic robots saving the world. We walked slowly toward the house, my suitcase rolling down the driveway. Ezra walked with his head down, as if preparing for imminent punishment. I gripped his hand tighter, mentally promising that I wouldn't let anyone else hurt him. I stopped at the front door. I could still see the silhouettes of Tate and Evie by the fireplace through the frosted glass. They hadn't even noticed their son had disappeared from view for a few minutes. I took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. It was a long wait, so long that I was about to ring it a second time when I heard footsteps approaching. The door opened and I saw Tate. My son, once the center of my universe, now looked like a stylish stranger wearing an expensive cashmere sweater with a neatly trimmed beard, smelling of expensive perfume. His eyes widened in surprise. Mom, what are you doing here? His gaze fell on Ezra, who was hiding behind me, still wrapped in my coat. Ezra, did you go out? There was more annoyance than concern in his voice. Mom told you to stay put. Your son didn't go out? My voice sounded so cold I didn't recognize it myself. He'd been outside the whole time, frozen, alone, on Christmas Day. Tate frowned, looked over his shoulder as if checking to see if Evie could hear us, then looked at me again. Mom, you don't understand. Ezra is grounded. He broke the antique vase Evie's parents brought back from Italy. It was a gift for our anniversary. He's a kid, Tate. I tried to speak softly but firmly. Kids break things sometimes. That's no reason to put him outside for hours in cold weather. It's a teachable moment. Tate straightened up, assuming a defensive posture. Evie thinks it's important that Ezra understands the consequences of his actions. Consequences? I couldn't believe my ears. What consequences should a 5-year-old understand, other than the fact that his parents were willing to subject him to hypothermia because of an accidentally broken vase? Tate? Who's there? Evie's voice came from deep inside the house. My son threw me a warning glance. Look, Mom, I know you're worried, but we have our own parenting methods, and I'd prefer it if you gave me a little more notice when you were coming. I called, I reminded her. Evie said you were going to Santa Barbara. Confusion flickered on Tate's face, which quickly turned to annoyance. Yeah, that was the plan, but we decided to stay home. And you forgot to tell me? He didn't answer, just shifted awkwardly from foot to foot. Tate? Evie's voice came closer. Who's there this early? And then she appeared in the doorway slim, perfectly styled even on Christmas morning, in a silk house dress that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in a year. Her eyes narrowed when she saw me. Lorraine? What a surprise! Her gaze shifted to Ezra, who was still clinging to me. Ezra? Her voice was instantly harsh. I told you to stay outside until I let you in. The boy flinched and squeezed my hand tighter. I felt a shiver run through his body. Evie, I tried to keep my voice calm, even though I was seething inside. It's cold and damp outside. Ezra is freezing. He's been out there for hours. That's part of his punishment, Evie cut in. He should realize that actions have consequences. Ezra, go to your room, now. I felt the boy tense, ready to obey. I didn't let go of his hand. No, I said firmly. Ezra's not going anywhere alone. Evie's eyes widened with surprise and anger. I beg your pardon? You have no right to tell our son what to do in our house. And you have no right to put a child in danger, I countered. Leaving a 5-year-old boy alone outside in the cold is neglecting his parental responsibilities. Tate stepped forward, his face reddening. Mom, I think you should leave. You're upsetting Evie and meddling in our family affairs. Family matters? I looked him right in the eye. I'm family too, Tate. I'm your mother and Ezra's grandmother, and I'm not leaving knowing he's being mistreated. Mistreated? Evie laughed, but there was no mirth in her laugh. You're exaggerating, Lorraine. Ezra was punished for breaking a valuable object. That's normal parenting. Normal parenting doesn't include leaving a child out in the cold, I said, and I'm sure social services would agree with me. Evie's face changed at the mention of social services. She glanced quickly at Tate, then back at me. Are you threatening us? I'm just stating a fact. I hugged Ezra tighter. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to come in. Ezra needs to warm up. Tate and Evie looked at each other as if in silent consultation. Then Tate reluctantly stepped back, making room. All right, come on in, but we need to have a serious talk, Mom. I walked through the house, still holding Ezra's hand. It was warm inside, smelling like pine needles from the tree and cinnamon from some Christmas candles. The living room looked like a picture from a design magazine. Every detail had been thought out and blended perfectly with the overall style. There were 2 glasses of unfinished wine by the fireplace and an open bottle of expensive red wine, judging by the label. On the coffee table were open boxes of gifts, clearly intended for adults, not children. Ezra, go upstairs, Evie commanded. The adults need to talk. I felt the boy tense up, ready to follow orders. His hand in mine grew even colder. No, I said calmly. Ezra will stay with me. I turned to my grandson. You're cold, sweetie. Let's find you something warm and make you some hot chocolate, okay? Ezra looked at his mother uncertainly, as if asking for permission. Evie pressed her lips together, but didn't say anything. I took that as acquiescence and headed into the kitchen, leading Ezra behind me. The kitchen was just as stylish and spotless as the living room chrome surfaces, modern appliances, not a speck, not a trace of use. I sat Ezra down on a high chair by the kitchen island and removed my coat from him, replacing it with a kitchen towel that I wrapped around his shoulders. Where do you have the cocoa? I asked, opening the cabinets. In the top cabinet on the left, Ezra answered quietly. But Mom says cocoa is only for special occasions. Christmas is a special occasion. I smiled at him, pulling out a jar of cocoa powder. And so is meeting Grandma. While I was making hot chocolate, I heard Tate and Evie's muffled voices from the living room. They were clearly arguing, and though I couldn't make out the words, the tone was tense. I set the mug of steaming drink in front of Ezra and sat down next to him. Careful, it's hot. Blow on it first. He obediently blew on the surface of the chocolate, then took a small sip. A chocolate mustache remained on his upper lip, and I couldn't help but smile. Did it taste good? I asked. Ezra nodded, smiling slightly for the first time. That shy smile broke my heart. How little it takes to please a child, and how little of that joy he seemed to get. Grandmother, he whispered, leaning toward me. Are you here for good? No, honey. I stroked his hair. I only came for Christmas, but I can come more often if you want. He nodded, then looked away, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. Mom will be angry, he whispered even more quietly. She says he stammered, as if hesitant to repeat what he'd heard. That I what? I asked softly. That you're uneducated and interfering with our family, Ezra blurted out, and then he lowered his eyes as if he expected me to get angry. The words hit me like a slap in the face. Not so much the words themselves I'd known before that Evie had a low opinion of me, but the fact that they were being said in front of a child, shaping his attitude toward a grandmother he barely knew. Well, everyone has an opinion, I said as casually as I could. But you know what? Grandmothers are very important. They have a special love for their grandchildren, and I love you very, very much, even if I don't see you much. Ezra looked at me carefully, as if assessing the sincerity of my words. Then he nodded, as if accepting this new information. I love you too, Grandma, he said so quietly that I could barely hear him. At that moment, Tate and Evie walked into the kitchen. Evie looked furious, but she tried to keep her composure. Tate seemed embarrassed and avoided looking me in the eye. Ezra, Evie's voice was deceptively soft. Why don't you go upstairs and change? Then you can open your presents under the Christmas tree. Ezra looked at me as if asking for permission. I nodded. He really did have to change out of his wet pajamas. Go on, sweetie. I'll be here when you get back. He got off the chair and, casting one last glance at me, walked out of the kitchen. As soon as his footsteps were silent on the stairs, Evie turned to me, dropping her mask of politeness. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed. "Breaking into our house uninvited, interfering with our son's upbringing, threatening us with social services." I straightened up, looking her straight in the eye. "I didn't barge in. I rang the doorbell. And yes, I will intervene when I see my grandson being mistreated." "Mistreated?" Evie laughed. "You're being dramatized. Ezra was being punished for breaking an expensive item, leaving a 5-year-old in the cold for hours." I shook my head. "That's not punishment, that's cruelty." "Mom," Tate interjected, a warning in his voice, "you're exaggerating. Ezra was outside for a short time, and we watched him through the window." "A short time?" I couldn't believe my ears. "Ezra told me he was sent outside before dawn. It's almost 10 o'clock in the morning." "He's exaggerating," Evie said quickly. "Kids always exaggerate when they want sympathy." I remembered Ezra's blue lips, his icy hands, the way he was shivering under my coat. "I saw his condition," I said quietly. "He'd been outside long enough to freeze hard, on Christmas morning, while you two were sitting by the fireplace drinking wine." Tate and Evie looked at each other. Something resembling shame flashed across Tate's face, but it quickly disappeared. "Look, Mom," he sighed. "I understand you're worried, but we have our own way of parenting. Ezra has to learn responsibility and the consequences of his actions." "Responsibility?" I couldn't help the bitterness in my voice. "He's a child, Tate, a child. His only responsibility is to be happy and loved, and it's your responsibility to make sure he is." "Don't tell us how to raise our son," Evie hissed. "You raised Tate without a father, in poverty, working a demeaning job. You're not a role model for parenting." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. I looked at Tate, expecting him to object, to defend me, to say something about how I'd sacrificed everything for him. But he remained silent, avoiding my gaze. That's when I heard light footsteps on the stairs. Ezra had returned, changed into warm clothes. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, his eyes wide, as if he sensed the tension between the adults. I stood up and walked over to him, taking his hand. "Ezra, get your things together," I said calmly. "We're leaving." "What?" Tate stepped forward. "Mom, you can't just take our son away." I turned to him, feeling years of pain, frustration, and helplessness turn into firm resolve. "I'm taking him away from you," I said, looking into my son's eyes. "And I'm not kidding, Tate. What you're doing is neglect and cruelty, and I'm not going to let it continue." There was a heavy silence in the room. I held Ezra's hand tightly, feeling it tremble in my palm. Tate and Evie froze, as if unable to believe their ears. A drizzle was falling softly outside the window, beating a quiet rhythm on the windowsill, the only sound in the ringing silence of the living room. "You can't just take our son away," Tate finally said, his voice strained. "It's kidnapping, Mom. Do you realize I could call the police?" I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Ezra pressed himself against me, and I could feel his little heart racing. "I'm not going to kidnap Ezra," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just want him to be safe, and from what I've seen today, he's not safe with you." "This is ridiculous," Evie interjected, crossing her arms over her chest. "You're making a big deal out of this." Yes, Ezra was grounded. Yes, he spent some time on the streets, but it's part of the educational process. An educational process? I couldn't believe my ears. Leaving a child out in the cold for hours is not parenting, Evie. It's cruelty. "We watched him through the window," Tate said quickly. "He wasn't in any danger, and it was just—" Well, a timeout strategy, so he could think about his behavior. I looked at my son, trying to recognize in this cold, rationalizing cruelty the boy I'd raised. The Tate who cried when he found an injured bird in the garden and sat with it for hours until I took it to the vet. That Tate who gave his pocket money to a homeless man on the street because he needs it more, Mom. Time out? In pajamas? In wet weather? On the street? I shook my head. Tate, listen to yourself. Do you really think this is normal? Something flashed in his eyes. Doubt? Shame? But he quickly pulled himself together. Mom, I know that it seems, wrong, but Evie and I have our own system of parenting. Ezra needs to understand that actions have consequences. I'm 5 years old, Ezra said suddenly, his voice quiet but distinct. We all looked at him in surprise. He rarely spoke in the presence of all three adults at the same time. What did you say, sweetie? I asked, leaning toward him. I'm 5 years old, he repeated, as if that explained everything. And in a way, it did. He's only 5, a little boy who should be playing, laughing, learning to trust the world, not shivering in the cold outside because of an accidentally broken vase. Exactly, Ezra. I stroked his head. You're only 5 years old, Evie snorted. That's not an argument. At his age, kids should be starting to understand responsibility. My father always said that character is formed before the age of 7. And how was your character formed, Evie? I asked, looking her straight in the eye. Were you left outside as a punishment, too? Her cheeks flushed slightly. That's none of your business. But for the record, my parents were strict, and I'm grateful for that. They instilled in me discipline and responsibility. And a complete lack of empathy, I added quietly. Dash, dash, Mom, Tate exclaimed. You're out of line. Me? I looked at him in disbelief. I'm out of line? Leaving a child out in the cold isn't out of line? Tate ran his hand through his hair, a gesture he'd done since he was a kid when he was nervous. Look, why don't we all just calm down a little? Let's sit down and talk like adults. No accusations. I looked at Ezra, who was still holding onto my hand. His big eyes went from one adult to another, like he was watching a tennis match. Ezra, honey. I leaned over to him. Why don't you go to your room and play for a while the adults talk? He looked at me anxiously. You're not gonna leave? Dash, he whispered. No. I gripped his hand tighter. I'm not going anywhere without you. I promise. He nodded, cast a wary glance at his parents, and walked slowly toward the stairs. We were all silent until his footsteps were silent at the top. Sit down. Evie gestured to the couch, taking the chair opposite. Her posture was tense, her back straight as a string. I sat down, folding my hands in my lap. Tate lowered himself next to me, keeping his distance. Mom, I understand that you're worried, he began. But you have to understand that Evie and I have our own way of parenting. We want Ezra to grow up to be a responsible, disciplined man. By putting him out in the cold in his pajamas? I couldn't help the bitterness in my voice. You're being dramatic, Evie interjected. It wasn't freezing outside, and we were watching him. He was there for hours, I said. In light pajamas, in the wet weather. He was shivering when I found him. His hands were icy cold. He's always had a flair for the dramatic. Evie brushed it off. Just like his father. I felt anger rising in me, but I tried to hold it back. You know, this reminds me of my own childhood, I said, staring into the space between Tate and Evie. My mother believed in strict punishments, too. I broke her favorite figurine one winter. She made me stand in a corner in an unheated hallway for 3 hours. I got so cold I had pneumonia for 2 weeks. I looked right at Tate. When I was pregnant with you, I swore that I would never treat my child like that you would never be afraid of me, never shiver in the cold as punishment. I kept that promise. And now I look at you and see you doing to your son what I protected you from. Tate lowered his eyes, avoiding my gaze. This is different, Mom. Times have changed. All parents use timeouts now. Timeout is putting your child in a chair in the corner of the room for 5 minutes, I said. Not putting him outside for hours on Christmas morning. You don't understand. Evie stepped forward. Ezra is a very stubborn child. The usual methods don't work on him. We have to be, creative in our approaches. Creative? I couldn't believe my ears. You call that creative? I call it cruelty. There you go again. Evie rolled her eyes. Tate, I told you your mother dramatized everything. Now, do you see why I didn't want her to see Ezra much? She's undermining our authority, imposing her outdated views on parenting. I stared at her, not believing my ears. Was that why I wasn't allowed to see my grandson? Evie was afraid I'd see how they were treating him? Tate, I turned to my son. Do you really think what you're doing is okay? Look at your son. He's afraid of both of you. He trembles when Evie raises her voice. Is that normal? Tate fidgeted uneasily in his seat. Mom, you're exaggerating. Ezra's a little shy, it's true, but he's not afraid of us. He just, respects our rules. Respects? Or afraid to break them? I shook my head. Tate, I know what fear is in the eyes of a child. I saw it in my own eyes when I looked in the mirror as a child. And now I see it in Ezra's eyes. Something resembling doubt flashed across Tate's face, but Evie quickly intervened. This is ridiculous. You've only been here half an hour, and you're already drawing conclusions about our family, about our upbringing. You, a woman who worked as a cab dispatcher and barely made ends meet, are trying to tell us how to raise a child. Her words hit me like a slap in the face. Not so much the mention of my poverty. I'd never been ashamed of my job, but the contempt with which she said it. Yes, I worked as a dispatcher, I said, straightening up. I worked as a dispatcher to make sure Tate had everything he needed after his father died. I worked overtime to pay for his art classes, his college. I sacrificed my dreams, my comfort, so he could have everything. And I never, ever left him on the streets as punishment. Tate stared at the floor, his shoulders tense. He didn't defend me, didn't object to Evie, and in that moment I was struck with a bitter realization. It wasn't just Evie's influence that had made my son this way. I played a part in it too. You know, Tate, I said quietly, I think it's partly my fault. He lifted his head, looking at me in surprise. I've spoiled you too much, allowed you too much. After your father died, you became the center of my universe. I was afraid to be strict, afraid you would suffer more. I didn't set boundaries, didn't teach you empathy or responsibility. Tate frowned. Dash. Mom, what are you talking about? I was a normal kid. Yes, you were a normal kid, I agreed, but I wasn't a perfect mother. I was so afraid of hurting you that I didn't teach you how to deal with it. I was always protecting you from the consequences of your actions, always making excuses. And now you've grown up to be a man who doesn't realize that some things are unjustifiable, like leaving a child out in the cold as punishment. Evie snorted. Typical. First, you accuse us of being cruel. Then suddenly, it's all your fault because you were too good a mother. Why don't you make up your mind? I ignored her and continued, looking directly at Tate. I thought love was about always giving, never demanding. But love is also about setting boundaries, teaching respect, setting an example of empathy. I failed at that part. And now I see the result. Tate looked confused, like he didn't know how to respond to my words. Mom, you're exaggerating. Yes, maybe Ezra's punishment was a little harsh, but that doesn't mean I'm some kind of monster or a bad father. I'm not saying you're a monster, Tate. I sighed. I'm saying that you're letting your son suffer and you don't see it as a problem, and that scares me. The Sunset Inn wasn't exactly a luxury motel. The shabby carpeting in the hallways, the slightly faded curtains on the windows, the decade-old television set, all of it made it look modest, even a little dull. But on Christmas Day, there was no choice. Most hotels were either closed or booked in advance. I was lucky to find a spare room with 2 beds. Ezra sat on the edge of the bed, dangling his feet from the floor, looking around curiously. In the 2 hours since we'd left Tate and Evie's house, he'd slowly begun to thaw, becoming more like a normal 5-year-old than the scared, silent boy I'd found on the street. "Grandma, how long are we gonna be here?" he asked, watching me unpack the few things we'd managed to take with us. "I don't know, honey. Maybe a few days," I answered, trying to keep my voice lighthearted. "How's a little vacation with me sound?" Ezra nodded, but his face remained serious. "Dash, Mom's gonna be mad. Don't worry about it." I sat down next to him, placing my hand gently on his shoulder. "The adults will sort it out amongst themselves. Your job is to just be a kid and get some rest, okay?" He nodded again, but I could see he wasn't completely convinced. For too long, he'd been taught to worry about how adults, especially his mother, would react. The last few minutes at Tate and Evie's house had been tense. After I told them I was taking Ezra away, a violent scene ensued. Evie threatened to call the police. Tate floundered between supporting his wife and trying to calm me down. At one point, I saw uncertainty in his eyes, which gave me hope. Perhaps, somewhere deep down inside, he realized that the way they were treating their son was wrong. Eventually, after much bickering, Tate agreed to a compromise. Ezra would stay with me for one day until tomorrow, while they thought things through. Evie was furious, but Tate managed to convince her that it was better than a scandal involving the police on Christmas Day. We quickly gathered the essentials: a few changes of clothes for Ezra, his toothbrush, his favorite toy, that transformer robot, and left in a cab. Now, sitting in that modest motel room with my grandson, I tried to figure out if I had done the right thing. Was my decision to take Ezra away impulsive? Had I hurt him more by taking him away from his familiar environment, even if it was toxic? "Grandma, do you have anything to eat?" Ezra's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. I hadn't had breakfast today. I felt my heart clench. Of course the baby was hungry. It was almost 2 in the afternoon, and he, put outside in the early morning, hadn't even had a chance to eat breakfast. "Of course, sweetie." I stood up and walked over to the bag that held Christmas gifts for Tate and his family. In addition to the basic gifts, I had brought a box of homemade cookies, as always. "It's not time for a real dinner, but I have cookies. We'll have a little snack and then we'll find somewhere to eat for real, okay?" Ezra's eyes lit up at the sight of a beautiful tin box depicting a winter landscape. "Mom says sweets ruin your teeth," he said, but his gaze was fixed on the box. "Sometimes, on special occasions, you can have a little sweetness." I opened the box, revealing neat rows of cinnamon, ginger, and chocolate chip cookies. "And today is a very special day. Christmas and our meeting." He tentatively reached out and took a chocolate chip cookie. Taking a small bite, he covered his eyes, and the first real smile of the day appeared on his face. "Yummy," he said, and in that moment, he looked exactly what he was supposed to be: a happy 5-year-old enjoying the simple joy of a sweet treat. While Ezra ate his cookies, I called the front desk and asked what restaurants were open on Christmas Day. I was informed that most places were closed, but there was a family-owned diner across the street that was open on a reduced schedule. "What do you say we go to the diner across the street?" I asked, turning back to Ezra. "You can order a real meal there." He nodded, finishing his second cookie. "Can I take Optimus?" he asked, pointing to his robot. Sure, I smiled. Optimus should have lunch with us too. Jenny's Diner was a cozy place with red leather couches and Christmas decorations on every table. Despite the festive day, there were a few customers, apparently casual visitors to the city like us. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a tired but friendly face, escorted us to a table by the window. Christmas menu today, she said, handing us laminated cards. Your choice of turkey, ham, or roast beef, with side dishes and dessert. What will you have, Ezra? I asked, helping him into a chair. He set the robot beside him as if it were another member of the dinner party. Ezra looked uncertainly at the menu, then at me. My mom usually picks for me, he said quietly. She says kids don't know how to choose the right food. I tried not to show how hurt I was by those words. Another reminder of Evie's controlling behavior. Well, what would you like to try? I asked softly. Turkey, ham, or roast beef? He thought for a second, as if it were the most important choice of his life. Could I Could I have turkey? He asked gently, as if he was afraid I'd say no. Sure, honey. Turkey is a great choice for Christmas. I smiled at him and turned to the waitress. Turkey for the boy, and for me too, please. When the waitress left, Ezra looked up at me. Grandma, do you like turkey too? Or did you just order it because I picked it out? I was surprised at the insightfulness of his question. I do love turkey, I answered honestly. But even if I didn't, it would have been okay to order the same thing you did. Sometimes people do things not because they like them, but to please others or to support them. You know? He nodded slowly, as if pondering a new and difficult concept. Like when mom smiles at guests, even though she's actually angry? This comment struck me again with its insight. The little boy saw the falseness in adult behavior. Something like that, I said cautiously, though there's a difference between doing something out of politeness and pretending to be something you're not. We continued talking while we waited for our food. I asked Ezra simple questions about his favorite toys, about what he likes to do, about his friends in kindergarten. Gradually, he began to talk in more detail. His voice became livelier, and more expressions appeared on his face. I learned that he likes to draw, but only when Daddy is home. Mommy says the paint stains. That he has one good friend in kindergarten named Noah, and that he likes stories about space and robots. When the food arrived, Ezra at first ate cautiously, in small bites, as if he was afraid of being scolded for being sloppy. But gradually, seeing that I did not admonish him, he began to eat more naturally, with the appetite of a healthy child. Did you have Christmas dinner at home, too? He asked between bites of turkey. No, honey, I answered. I was going to make it tonight when I got home. But now I have something much better, Christmas with you. He smiled, but then his face turned serious again. Will Dad and Mom be looking for me? They know you're with me, I assured him. We agreed that you would stay with me for a little while. Like a little vacation. I didn't mention that a little in Tate and Evie's mind meant just one day. I hadn't decided what I was going to do tomorrow when they demanded Ezra back. After lunch, we went back to the motel. My phone, which I'd turned off before going to the diner, showed 5 missed calls from Tate. I didn't call back right away, deciding to put Ezra down for a day's rest first. It had been an emotionally intense day for the little boy, and I could see he was tired. Why don't you get some sleep? I suggested, helping him take off his shoes and laying down next to him on the bed. I can read you something. I don't have any books here, Ezra said, hugging his robot. Then I could tell you a story, I suggested. Which one would you like to hear? He thought for a second. A story about Daddy when he was little, he asked. My heart squeezed. Even now, after everything that had happened, the boy wanted to hear about his dad. I started telling him about how little Tate loved to draw, how he built a fort out of pillows and blankets in the living room, how we flew a kite together in the park. I talked about the Tate I knew and loved, a boy with a kind heart and a bright smile. Somewhere in the middle of my story, Ezra fell asleep, still hugging his robot tightly. I got up carefully, trying not to wake him, and walked over to the window. Outside the glass, I could see the motel's small pool, now closed for the winter, and a parking lot with a few cars in it. The Christmas I had planned to spend alone in my apartment had turned out in a most unexpected way. And now I was standing in an unfamiliar city, in a cheap motel, with a grandson I hardly knew, deciding what to do next. I pulled out my cell phone and turned it on. Almost immediately it rang. Tate, Mom, where are you? His voice sounded strained. I've called you several times already. We're safe, I answered quietly, looking at Ezra sleeping. At the Sunset Inn Motel. We just had lunch. Ezra's asleep now. You need to bring him home, Tate said. Now. What you did? It's almost kidnapping, Mom. Do you realize we could call the police? We agreed that Ezra would be with me until tomorrow, I reminded him. You agreed to this, Tate. I agreed under duress. His voice became harsh. You came to our house, accused us of abusing our son, threatened social services. What was I supposed to do? I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Tate, I saw Ezra sitting outside in his pajamas in the cold weather. I saw the bruises on his arms. These aren't accusations, they're facts. Facts taken out of context, he objected. Yes, we punished him, maybe too harshly, but it was an isolated incident. You're making a big deal out of this, Mom. An isolated incident? I couldn't help the bitterness in my voice. And the bruises from the tackle? Is that an isolated incident, too? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Evie didn't mean to hurt him, Tate said finally, his voice sounding less confident. She's just emotional, and Ezra sometimes provokes her with his stubbornness. I couldn't believe my ears. My son was justifying physical abuse of a child. Tate, listen to yourself, I said quietly. You're justifying your wife hurting your son. No 5-year-old deserves to be treated like that, no matter how stubborn he is. You don't understand. Tate's voice became defensive. We have a difficult situation. Evie is under a lot of pressure at work, and Ezra, he's not the most obedient kid. He's just a kid, Tate. I felt tears come to my eyes. Your baby, my grandson, and I'm not going to let him be treated the way you've never been treated. We talked for a few more minutes, mostly repeating the same arguments. Eventually, Tate relented and said that he and Evie would discuss the situation and call me tomorrow. I wasn't sure if I could believe him, but at least it gave me some time to think. After talking to Tate, I called Martha King, an old friend of mine who'd worked in social services for 20 years in child welfare before retiring. If anyone could give me sound advice, it was her. Lorraine? Martha's voice sounded surprised. Merry Christmas. I wasn't expecting your call today. Merry Christmas, Martha, I said. I'm sorry to bother you on a holiday, but I have a difficult situation. I briefly told her everything that had happened, about finding Ezra on the street, about the bruises, about the confrontation with Tate and Evie, about our current situation. Oh my God, Lorraine, Martha sighed when I was done. What a terrible situation. How is Ezra now? Physically, he's fine, I answered, looking at the sleeping boy. Emotionally, it's hard to say. He's very reserved for his age, wary. But today I saw glimpses of a normal 5-year-old. Curious, smiling. I think inside he's still the little boy he should be. That's a good sign, Martha said. Children are remarkably resilient. But, Lorraine, do you realize you're in a legally tricky position? Technically, you don't have the right to hold a child without parental consent. I know, I sighed. But what am I supposed to do? Return him to a home where he's being treated like this? Do you have evidence of abuse? Martha asked practically. Pictures of bruises, medical reports, witness statements? No, I admitted. Just my observations and what Ezra had told me. That may not be enough, Martha warned me. But here's what you can do. First, if you're seriously concerned about the boy's safety, you can file an anonymous report with Child Protective Services. They're required to investigate every report of possible abuse. Won't they take him away right away? I asked anxiously. I don't want Ezra to get into the system. I've read so many horror stories. Not necessarily, Martha reassured me. In most cases, they do an assessment of the situation first. If there's no immediate threat to the child's life, they can assign the family a support program, parenting classes, counseling sessions with a psychologist, regular check-ins. I considered her words. Maybe this would be the best solution? Not to tear Ezra away from her parents completely, but to provide external monitoring of the family's situation? And the second option? I asked. The second option is to try to negotiate with Tate and Evie directly, Martha said. Offer them a compromise. For example, regular meetings with Ezra under your supervision, perhaps a visit to the family counselor. If they agreed to that, you could keep in touch with your grandson and control the situation without bringing the authorities into the picture. It sounded reasonable, but I doubted Evie would agree to such a compromise. She clearly saw me as a threat to her control over the family. Thank you, Martha, I said. I'll think about it. It's so hard to decide what's right. I know, dear, Martha said with sympathy in her voice. In situations like this, there's rarely an obvious right decision. But whatever you decide, remember, your first responsibility is to your child's well-being. After my conversation with Martha, I sat in the chair by the window, watching Ezra sleeping and pondering my options. Part of me wanted to believe that things could be fixed, that Tate would realize his mistakes, that Evie would change and we'd be a normal family again. That part whispered that maybe I really was exaggerating, that one incident of punishment in the cold didn't mean systematic abuse, but the other part, the more realistic part, realized that the problem was much deeper. The bruises on Ezra's arm, his intimidated look, the way he flinched at a sudden sound, all of it spoke of a child living under constant stress, and Tate's unwillingness to acknowledge the problem, his willingness to justify Evie's actions. This was not the family I wanted for my grandchild. My phone rang again. This time it wasn't Tate, but Evie. I hesitated, but then answered anyway. Listen to me carefully, Lorraine. Evie's voice was cold and collected. I understand that you consider yourself Ezra's protector, but what you're doing is destroying our family and traumatizing my son. Your son? I couldn't contain my bitterness. What about the fact that you're traumatizing him with your parenting methods? That's ridiculous, Evie snorted. One stern lesson and you're declaring me a monster. You have no idea what it's like to raise a child in today's world. Not with your experience as a dispatcher and living in a cheap apartment. Her words were meant to hurt me, to make me feel inferior. But this time, I didn't let them hurt me. I know what it's like to raise a child alone, working full-time to provide for her. I said calmly, and I know that no circumstance justifies leaving a 5-year-old boy out in the cold or grabbing him so hard that he's bruised. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Evie said in a suddenly different tone, softer and more conciliatory, Look, Lorraine, I understand that you're worried. It's natural. You're his grandmother. But can't we all just chill out a little? You get Ezra back and we can talk about how you could see him more often. Maybe weekly visits, or you could take him away for the weekend once in a while. Tate and I were just talking about that. I was surprised at this sudden change. It wasn't like the Evie I knew, cold, controlling, unwilling to share her family. Something didn't add up here. Evie, I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but this isn't about my visits right now. It's about Ezra's safety. I've seen the bruises. I've seen the way he shakes with fear when you raise your voice. That's not normal. I realize you feel that way. Evie's voice remained soft, almost hypnotic. But believe me, Tate and I love Ezra more than anything in the world. Yes, I may be too strict sometimes. I'm working on that. But separating a child from his parents is not the answer, you understand? I felt something inside me hesitate. Maybe I had really overreacted. Maybe Evie is genuinely remorseful and ready to change. But then I remembered Ezra's face as he sat on the cold curb on Christmas morning, his blue lips, his trembling hands, and I also remembered Martha's words, "Your first responsibility is the welfare of the baby." Evie, I said, growing stronger in my decision, I believe that you and Tate love Ezra in your own way, but I also believe that he's not safe with you right now. I'm not talking about permanent separation. I'm talking about both of you needing help, counseling, parenting classes, perhaps family therapy. And until you get that help, Ezra is safe with me. You have no right to decide that. Evie's voice changed instantly, becoming cold and harsh again. We're his parents. We decide what's best for our son. And I'm his grandmother, I replied, feeling the resolve growing in me. And I'm not going to stand by knowing that he's being mistreated, even if it means going against my own son. The spring wind played with the tulle curtains, bringing the smell of blossoming trees into the apartment. March was warm this year, as if nature was in a hurry to erase the traces of winter, to give the world a new beginning. I stood at the window, watching Ezra ride his new bike down the path in the yard. 3 months had passed since that Christmas day, when I'd found him shivering in the cold on the street in front of Tate and Evie's house. 3 months that changed everything. I still remember Judge Hanson's face, a not young woman with deep wrinkles around her eyes and a tenacious, scrutinizing gaze. When she made her ruling, temporary custody of Ezra would be transferred to me, while Tate and Evie were required to take parenting classes and family therapy. The court finds that in this situation, the welfare of the child requires a stable and safe environment, which at this time the grandmother can provide, she said firmly, ignoring Evie's indignant look and the shocked expression on Tate's face. The road to this decision had been long and painful. After that Christmas day at the motel, I hadn't returned Ezra to his parents as they had demanded. Instead, I contacted Child Protective Services, as Martha had advised. The social worker, a young woman named Riley, did an initial assessment of the situation, and her conclusion was disappointing. There were signs of emotional abuse and neglect sufficient to open a case. Tate and Evie were furious. They hired an expensive lawyer, accused me of slander, of manipulating Ezra, of trying to steal their son because of their own loneliness and bitterness. There were moments when I almost gave up, when I doubted the rightness of my path. But every time I looked at Ezra, at his gradually reviving face, at his timid smile that grew more confident each day, I knew I couldn't give up. The key factor in the judgment was the testimony and medical records. Susan Ellington testified about what she saw in the park. The doctor who examined Ezra confirmed the bruising characteristic of a forceful grab, and perhaps most decisive of all, Ezra's own testimony, given in the presence of a child psychologist who specialized in abuse cases. Ezra, with his usual childlike candor, recounted the punishments, how he was left outside when he was naughty, how Evie shook him when she was angry, how he was afraid to make noise or cry because Mommy doesn't like noise. His words on the official record became something that couldn't be ignored or explained away as exaggeration. And so now Ezra was living with me. We moved into a new apartment, a larger two-bedroom unit in a quiet neighborhood in Escondido, not far from the park. My retirement savings were enough for rent, and the additional court-ordered expenses for Ezra had to be covered by Tate and Evie. I watched my grandson make lap after lap around the path, getting more and more confident with the bike, and thought about how much he'd changed in those 3 months. When he first moved in with me, he was a quiet, cautious child who was like walking through a minefield, afraid to make the wrong move. He asked permission for everything: if he could go to the bathroom, if he could drink water, if he could have another piece of bread. He apologized for every little mistake, from spilled juice to a misassembled puzzle. And he didn't cry, ever, even when he bruised his knee to the point of bleeding after falling off a swing set at the park. He has impaired emotional regulation, explained Dr. Lynn, the child psychologist Ezra saw twice a week. He's been indoctrinated that it's dangerous to express his feelings, especially negative feelings. So he suppresses them, even natural ones like pain or fear. Working with Dr. Lynn has been slow, but I've seen progress. First through games and drawings, then through stories and role playing. Ezra was learning to express his emotions, learning to trust adults, learning to be a child who didn't have to fear punishment all the time. The first time Ezra cried at my house, real, loud tears with snot and screaming, was probably one of the happiest moments of those 3 months. It happened when his favorite Transformer robot broke. His arm fell off and he couldn't fix it himself. Ezra stood holding the broken toy, his face contorted, and suddenly he just exploded into sobs. I'm sorry, he repeated between sobs, and I realized he was expecting punishment for his tantrum. It's okay, honey, I said, taking a seat next to him. It's okay to cry. You're upset, and it's a normal reaction. Let's fix your robot together. Gradually, his crying subsided, and when I returned the toy, already with an arm attached, Ezra looked at me with such wonder, as if I'd performed a miracle. But the miracle wasn't the toy that was fixed. It was the fact that he allowed himself to be vulnerable and saw that it didn't result in punishment. After that incident, something changed. Ezra became more open, more boisterous, more childlike. He started playing more freely, drawing with bright colors, which I bought despite Tate's grumbling that those stains never wash off, laughing louder. Tate and Evie visited him once a week under the supervision of a social worker. These visits were always tense. Evie was clearly angry, though she tried to hide it under the mask of a caring mother. Tate looked lost, torn between wanting to please his wife and trying to reconnect with his son. "How are you doing in school?" he asked, trying to start a conversation. "Good," Ezra answered, looking more at me than at his father. "Grandma's helping me with my reading, and I learned how to write my name." That's great," Tate said, and a strange expression appeared on his face, a mixture of pride and sadness, like he was just now realizing how much he'd missed out on. After the visits, Ezra usually became quieter, more thoughtful. Sometimes he would ask questions that broke my heart. "Grandma, why is Mommy always so angry? Did I do something bad?" "No, sweetie," I answered, trying to be honest but not denigrate his parents. "Your mom she has a hard time showing her feelings the right way. It's not your fault, and she's working on learning how to do that." Whether Evie was really working on herself was a big question. She'd been attending parenting classes and therapy sessions, as the court had ordered, but she'd done so with apparent reluctance. Tate seemed more sincere in his efforts, though his pride prevented him from fully acknowledging his role in what had happened. Tate and I's relationship had changed a lot since that Christmas day. From the initial rage and accusations, "You ruined my family," "You were always controlling," always thinking you knew best. He went from cold formality. He called to confirm details of visits, occasionally inquired about Ezra's progress with the psychologist, but our conversations were short and perfunctory. I understood his anger. In his eyes, I was a traitor, a woman who had made him look like a bad father in front of the courts, in front of social services, in front of the world. He couldn't or wouldn't see that my actions weren't motivated by a desire to punish him or Evie, but to protect Ezra. On days when the pain of alienation with my son became especially acute, I found solace in talking to Dr. Morgan, my own therapist. Yes, I had started going to therapy too, partly on the court's recommendation, partly because I felt I needed to. You did the right thing, Lorraine, doctor, Morgan would say when I shared my doubts. Sometimes the most loving action is the one that causes temporary pain but prevents long-term harm. We talked a lot about my relationship with Tate, about how I raised him after Randall's death, about my own childhood traumas and how they influenced my parenting style. You strive to give your son what you did not have yourself, Doctor, Morgan noted. Unconditional love, support, freedom from fear. But in your desire to protect him from pain, you may not have taught him how to cope or set healthy boundaries. It was a bitter lesson, but I was embracing it. I saw now how my own upbringing, with a mother who was cold and strict, a father who was either absent or explosive, had shaped my reactions, how I tossed between wanting to control Tate's life, to protect him, and the fear of being too demanding, to avoid becoming like my mother. The cycle can be broken, Doctor, Morgan was saying. You're already doing it by helping Ezra. And perhaps, in time, Tate will be able to see that path, too. Was I hoping for a reconciliation with my son? Honestly, I didn't know. Part of me, of course, longed for the boy I'd raised, for the connection we'd once had. But the other part of me realized that the relationship could not and should not go back to the way it was. If we ever reconnect, it will be a new relationship between two adults who see and respect each other's boundaries, not between a mother who sacrifices everything and a son who takes those sacrifices for granted, not between a woman who fears losing the love of her only child and a man who uses that love as a tool of control. Before, I would have done anything to win back Tate's affection. Apologize even if it wasn't my fault. I'd give in even if I knew I was right. I realize now that not only was this behavior hurting me, but it wasn't helping Tate become a better person. The sound of the door opening interrupted my musings. Ezra ran into the apartment, his face flushed from riding his bike, his eyes shining. Grandma, I learned how to do a tight turn. Do you want to see? Sure, honey, I smiled. Just drink some water first. You're totally out of breath. He ran over to the kitchen counter where I had already prepared a glass of water and drank in greedy gulps. There was a mud stain on his t-shirt, his hair sticking out in all directions from under the helmet I'd insisted he wear. He looked exactly what a happy 5-year-old boy should look like. After you show me your turn, we can have lunch, I said. I made your favorite turkey sandwiches. Can I draw later? Ezra asked, setting down his empty glass. I want to draw my robot in space. Sure, I nodded. The paints and paper are on your desk. He smiled happily and ran for the door, but stopped suddenly and came back to hug me tightly. This was another change. Ezra began to show affection more openly, without fear of being pushed away or labeled a crybaby. I love you, Grandma, he said simply and ran back outside. I stared after him, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. This was not how I had envisioned my retired life. I thought I would live quietly, maybe travel a little, enjoy the occasional visit from my grandson. Instead, I became the primary caregiver for a 5-year-old, litigating, attending therapy and parent support groups. Yet, despite all the challenges, I didn't regret my decision that Christmas morning. I watched Ezra blossom day by day, his childlike directness return, his trust in the world grow. It was worth everything. Through the open window, I could see Ezra proudly displaying his steeplechase, a little clumsy, but executed with such enthusiasm that it was impossible not to smile. At that moment, my phone vibrated, a message from Tate. Evie and I finished Module 3 of the parenting course today. Can I come in an hour earlier than usual this Saturday? I want to show Ezra the new game I bought. The text was dry, businesslike, but the request itself showed some progress. Tate wanted to spend more time with his son, was planning something specifically for him. Maybe the courses were actually helping. Maybe in time, I pushed those thoughts away. Now wasn't the time to dream of a full reconciliation or a return to my old life. What was important now was to focus on the present, on gradually healing Ezra, on creating a safe and loving environment for him. I replied with a short, "Yes, of course," and put the phone away. From the window came Ezra's laughter as he did another lap on his bike. That sound, so simple and pure, was the best confirmation that I was on the right track. I didn't know what the future would bring. Would the Ezras ever return to living with their parents permanently? Would Tate and Evie be able to truly change, or was their participation in the program just a formality to satisfy the court? Would Tate ever forgive me for what I had done? There were no easy answers to these questions, but one thing I knew for sure. I would no longer remain silent when I saw injustice. I would not put the desire to keep the peace above the need to protect the vulnerable. I will not sacrifice my principles for the approval of others, even those I love most. In my 67 years, I finally learned how to set healthy boundaries, a lesson that came late, but hopefully not too late to help my grandson avoid the same mistakes. Ezra waved at me from the window, proudly showing off his bike tricks, and I waved back, feeling my heart fill with quiet joy. We were both learning anew, him to be a kid, me to be strong, and there was a beauty and hope in this journey together, despite its challenges. I stepped out onto the porch to get a better view of his maneuvers and called out, "Nice turn, Ezra. Now show me how you brake." He smiled and demonstrated a rather spectacular stop, skidding the rear tire slightly. "Did you see that, Grandma? I can stop almost instantly now." "I see, honey. You're becoming quite the master." In his smile, in the pride in his accomplishments, in the confidence with which he shared his joy, I saw healing. Not complete, not final. That process would take years, but real healing. And while that healing was going on, I was ready to be there, to support, to guide, to love. It wasn't how I envisioned my retirement, but perhaps it was exactly what both Ezra and I needed. A new beginning, a new chance to create what we both lacked. A family where love doesn't depend on perfection, where mistakes don't lead to rejection, where everyone can be themselves without fear. And as my grandson enthusiastically showed me his bicycle tricks, I knew one thing. No matter how difficult our relationship with Tate had been, no matter how difficult the last few months had been, I had never regretted for a second the 5 words I had spoken that Christmas morning. "I'm taking him away from you."